All right, what about that? Is that better? Okay. All right, so we're in Nahum chapter 3. Ignore the slides for the time being. And we got to we finished verse 10 last week. So just a kind of a brief recap. So Nahum is a different type of prophetic book. It doesn't really say anything about God's people. It's purely a message against Assyria. So the entire book is about God going to punish Assyria for their evil deeds that they have done. And so in that regard, it's a little bit like Obadiah. So it's totally a message about a different country than God's people. So we'll finish this up tonight. There's just a few verses left, and then we'll get into Habakkuk. But so the last few verses, starting with verse 11. So what he's been talking about in chapter 3 is basically about their destruction at the end. He just finished a section in verses 8 through 10 where he kind of mocked them a little bit because Assyria had captured Thebes in 663, and Thebes is part of Egypt. And that was a very difficult part of Egypt to capture. It was a place that was considered to be probably uncapturable. And Assyria did capture it. And so then the question that Nahum is posing to them is Nineveh more difficult to capture than Thebes was? And they're both similar in the fact that they had a lot of natural defenses and so forth, but obviously the answer to the question is no. So if Thebes could fall, then Nineveh also could fall. So he just finished that little comment in 8 through 10, so we'll pick up now in verse 11. And it says, "You also will be drunk." And so he may be alluding to the fact that when Assyria actually does fall, supposedly a lot of the people and the soldiers were drunk when this happened, which is why they weren't able to fight back. They were drunk and couldn't really function. It says you will be hidden, which is another way of saying you'll disappear from history. So they'll be destroyed. They'll kind of fade away from history. People won't know who they were anymore, which is kind of funny because they did disappear from history in a sense. A lot of their cities weren't discovered for a long time by archaeology. They weren't. A lot of the major cities weren't discovered for several thousand years, really until like the 1700s. So the local people knew that there was stuff still there that had not been dug, but the cities had not been excavated until the 1800s and then into the early 20th century. And their language disappeared for a long time too. So they spoke Akkadian, which is an ancient Semitic language. It kind of got replaced with Aramaic over time. So you're familiar with Aramaic from the Gospels. But what had happened was, since Assyria was the world power, their language kind of became what you call the lingua franca for all of the ancient Near East. For a long time. So if you kind of think of their language like Latin was, and really what English is now. So if you're going to travel from country to country, there's usually one language that people can speak as you go from country to country. So for today, it's English is kind of the predominant language, international language, and in the Middle Ages it was Latin was the language. But at this time, the language was Akkadian, which is their language. But that language, it kind of faded out to Aramaic in around the 700-800s, somewhere in there, BC. But Akkadian kind of held on, kind of like Latin still does. People still study Latin. It's usually more of an academic type thing. And so Akkadian kind of held on really almost till the time of Jesus as sort of an academic type language. And then it just completely disappeared, and it wasn't even discovered again until I think the 18 or 1900s. So it disappeared for nearly 2,000 years, and now people know about it again. But anyway, that's the idea, is that you're going to be eliminated, and you're kind of going to be forgotten, okay? And then it goes on, it says, you will seek refuge, you will also seek refuge from the enemy. He may be referring to the fact that, so when Nineveh falls in 612, the king that is there at the time, he dies in the battle, but some of the people escape and they go to Haran, and they try to kind of reestablish the kingdom there. And one of the king's brothers becomes king and so forth. And so they kind of hold on for a little while, and that's what it's talking about. You'll seek refuge. They try to kind of regather themselves. Egypt will try to come help them, which we'll talk more about in a minute when we talk about Habakkuk. And none of it really takes hold. But that's probably what that's referencing. As you move on to verse 12, it says, all your strongholds are fig trees with ripened figs. So this is just an image. We're really not familiar with fig trees here probably, but it's like an apple tree. When the apples get ripe and you shake the branch, the apples fall. It's the same idea. So when the figs get ripe, they easily fall off the fig tree. And all he's really saying is your strongholds are going to fall just like a fig falls off the branch, okay? So he may be referring to two particular strongholds that fell right before Nineveh fell. So there's one that's in a city about 3 miles north of Nineveh, which was a kind of a fortress city nearby. I forget the exact name of that one. I have it written down if I can find it. And then the other one is a similar city, but it's south of Nineveh, and that one's called Ashur, which is where the name Assyria comes from, is the name of that town. The name of the country isn't actually Assyria. Assyria is I think it's the Latin version of it, if I remember rightly. The name is, the country is actually Ashur, okay? And so there's a city by the name of Ashur also. And so that's what he's probably referencing here, is these two cities that are kind of fortified cities near Nineveh that fell first, and then Nineveh falls later. Let's see. Okay, so verse 12, all your strongholds are fig trees with ripened figs. If they are shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater. So it's just the idea that these fortified cities are going to fall very easily, like a fig falls from the branches. Verse 13, surely your people in your midst are women. The ESV, instead of people, I think it says soldiers or troops. It says troops. The idea is, so one of the Assyrian kings, the Assyrians were pretty well known for mocking other people. And so one of his annals for one of the Assyrian kings, he makes fun of another country that they're attacking. And he says, all your troops are like women, meaning, they're mocking them and saying they're weak and will easily defeat you. Now all of their mocking and taunting is coming back on them, and so God is taunting them with the same taunts that they have issued to other people. He's now taunting them with the same type of taunts, okay? So it says, surely your people in your midst are women. In other words, your people aren't going to really fight back. They're going to be weak. It goes on. It says, the gates of your land are wide open for your enemies. The gates can be a couple things. It could be the terrain around the area. So there are some mountains and stuff around the area. It could be that those mountain passes become open, easier for troops to get into. It could be referring to those fortified cities nearby, or it could just literally be referring to the gates of the city of Nineveh itself. Anyway, whatever the case, whatever they were expecting to protect them is not going to protect them. That's the idea. It says, fire shall devour the bars of your gates. And so that is what ends up happening, is Nineveh does get destroyed by fire. The archaeological record shows that the city was destroyed by fire. Okay. All right, so verse 14. Now Nahum, or God, through Nahum, is going to taunt Nineveh for a couple verses and make fun of them. So God is going to basically tell them, oh, get ready for the attack, get ready, and knowing full well it's not going to do any good, but he's making fun of them in the process. So verse 14 says, draw your water for the siege. In other words, get ready for the siege that's about to come. which is funny because they don't even need to draw water. They have so much water there between the river, the two rivers and all the canals, and then they had aqueducts and all this stuff. So water wasn't really an issue for them. But anyway, it says draw water for the siege. So Nineveh was sieged. The siege lasted only about 3 months. So it fell pretty quickly when it happened. It says fortify your strongholds. So the walls around Nineveh were supposedly 50 feet thick and 100 feet high. And he's going to tell them that they need to get it stronger than that, which that's about the best wall you could have at that time. So they already have very strong walls. He's saying add to your defenses. And it's all for mockery. None of this is going to make any difference. It says go into the clay and tread the mortar, make strong the brick kiln. In other words, prepare to strengthen these walls and make them stronger. Verse 15, it says, there the fire will devour you. So that is how the city fell, with fire. The next line, the sword will cut you off. This is just a common ancient Near Eastern phrase for war, talking about the sword cutting you off. It's a typical idiom of the time. It just means you're going to fall in battle, basically. And then it says it will eat you up like a locust. And so locusts are known to destroy things, and that's the idea. Your city's going to fall. It's going to get destroyed, just like a locust swarm came in and destroyed it. Okay, then you'll notice you probably have a little break in the middle of the verse between that and the next. So the taunt's going to continue in the next little section here. It says, make yourself many like the locust, make yourself many like the swarming locust. And he's just saying, get as many people as you can together, get ready to fight, and so forth. And it's all a mockery. It's not going to change anything. But he's taunting them and telling them, prepare all your people, get more people if you can get more people. Okay, verse 16. It says, you have multiplied your merchants more than the stars of heaven. This is one of two things or both. So when Assyria would go out to war and their troops would go to these other countries to fight, there would always be merchants that would follow behind them to sell stuff to the troops to make money off of it. And so the more that they went around and fought, the more these merchants would kind of tail behind them. It may be referring to that, or it may just be referring to the fact they have a lot of merchants in the city. So Nineveh was kind of a trade hub for a lot of trade from the east to the west. So trading going from the Medes and the Persians, going westward over to Syria, Phoenicia, even down to Egypt. So it was a trade hub. Perhaps that's what he's talking about. Anyway, the idea is that you're very wealthy. You've got all this trade and so forth. And then the part at the end, the more than the stars of heaven, just means more than you can count. So you've got all these merchants. And so what's going to happen to them? Verse 16, it says, the locust plunders and flies away. In other words, all these merchants you have, when danger shows up, they're just going to run away. Okay, they're going to scatter. Which is what happened. A lot of the people just ran when the siege came. Verse 17, this says your commanders in the New King James. I think, the ESV is a little different, but it doesn't really matter. So it says your commanders are like swarming locusts and your generals like great grasshoppers. The ESV just says, I think, princes and scribes. It doesn't really matter. The idea is your leaders. He just gives a couple different terms for leaders. So New King James uses commanders and generals. That's fine. So your commanders are like swarming locusts and your generals like great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges on a cold day. When the sun rises, they flee away. And so what is he talking about? He's saying all of your leaders, when the danger comes, they're going to run, okay? So their leaders aren't going to stay there, and they're not going to fight. They're not going to lead the people. They're going to flee and try to save themselves, okay? So all these things that Assyria has made fun of all these other countries for, the exact same thing is going to happen to them. They've always been the bully. They've always been very terrifying to these other countries, but when the terror comes to them, instead of standing up and fighting, they just fold and they run, okay? And so God is making fun of them for that. They're just as bad as the people that they've made fun of, okay? Or just as weak and cowardly. Okay, let's see. So the last line of verse 17, and the place where they are is not known. So in other words, where they flee to, nobody really knows, okay? All right, verse 18, your shepherds slumber. So the last two verses are a direct message to the king of Assyria, okay? So verse 18, your shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. And shepherds there just means leaders. So in other words, your leaders are asleep, basically. Your nobles rest in the dust, which is another way of saying they're dead. Okay, if you rest in the dust, that means you're a corpse. So your nobles are, so your leaders are slumbering either because they're dead, they're drunk, they're not paying attention, they've ran, whatever the case. They're not there to do their job, okay? Your nobles are dead, essentially. Your people are scattered on the mountains, and no one gathers them. So if the people are scattered on the mountains and nobody gathers them, why is that the case? It's because they don't have any leadership anymore, okay? So when Babylon comes to destroy them, the leaders all run, all right? And so the people that are left behind don't have anybody to direct them to know what to do to fight against Babylon. And that's part of the reason the city falls so easily. All right, verse 19, your injury has no healing. In other words, you're going to suffer a mortal wound that you're not going to recover from. Your wound is severe. All who hear news of you will clap their hands over you, okay? And this is kind of something he said before. When Assyria falls, nobody's going to feel bad about it. Everybody hates Assyria. They have been the bully for a long time. What happens when a bully gets knocked down and defeated? Usually everybody cheers, right? Okay, and it's the same idea. When Assyria finally falls, nobody else is going to feel bad. All right, everybody's going to cheer and be happy about it. And so that's what God is taunting them with. And then the very last line says, for upon whom has not your wickedness passed continually? In other words, who have you been good to? Or the other way around is, who have you not been bad to, basically, is the idea, okay? And that's the end of Nahum. Now, the interesting thing is, if you notice the last line, the book ends with a question, okay? There's only 2 books in the whole Old Testament, maybe the whole Bible, but only 2 books in the Old Testament, at least, that end in a question. And they are Jonah and Nahum, and they're both about Nineveh, okay? So it's just sort of an interesting tie that kind of connects the book of Jonah with the book of Nahum. They're both about the same place, and they both end with a question, but the difference is in Jonah, God saves Nineveh. In Nahum, God destroys Nineveh, okay? And so that's the end of Nahum. Nahum's different. It's a book about a different country and about their coming punishment, which would have been a very popular message in Judah as they're listening to this, but it is a different kind of book. So does anybody have any questions on Nahum? Okay, so I'll just do a real brief recap just on the prophets we've talked about so far, and then we'll go into the intro on Habakkuk. So if you remember, we started with Joel and Amos. Joel and Amos, we started with them because you can't date them accurately, because they don't mention anything you can really date it with. They don't mention a king or anything like that. Joel, we kind of assume, is the earliest minor prophet that was written, but that's an assumption. And it probably was written to the northern kingdom. And the idea was God threatened them with punishment if they did not repent. The people do repent. And then the last chapter of Joel is, okay, since you repented, now I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do to your enemies. Okay, so that book ends great for the people of God because one, they repented, and two, God's saying he's going to destroy their enemies, which is always a popular message. Okay, then we went to Obadiah. Obadiah is also difficult to date because it doesn't mention a king or anything like that, but it may actually date to around the time of the fall of Jerusalem, which is actually later than what we're even in Nahum here. So it may go somewhere around 580s, 590s, but not really certain. But that message is very similar to Nahum in the fact that it's a message against a different country. Okay, so if you remember, Obadiah is a message against Edom. Okay, and so Edom was one of Israel and Judah's relatives, but also their enemies. They fought a lot with them. And so it would have also been a very popular message because it's a message of how God is going to punish them for the evil they have done. So the people of God would have enjoyed listening to that. Then we went in the ones you can actually date after that. So we started with Amos. Amos, if you remember, is a message to the northern kingdom. And he deals with a lot of different things, but he's kind of known for being the social justice prophet, where he talks a lot about how the people were mistreating each other, particularly the wealthy people were mistreating the poor, and how that was a violation of the law and so forth. So Amos spends a lot of time on that. Then we went to Hosea. Hosea is also a message to the northern kingdom, just maybe 15, 20 years after Amos, so they're fairly close in time. He touches a little bit on social justice like Amos, but he mostly focuses on how, one, the wealthy did not hold up what they should have been doing for the community. They did punish or take advantage of the poor. But also he spends a lot of time talking about how the priest did not lead the people and how the kings did not lead the people. And so it's really a message about bad leadership and how bad leadership is leading the country into ruin. Okay, and so Amos and Hosea are messages to the northern kingdom. Then we looked at Micah. Micah is like basically a short version of Hosea and Amos together. So a lot of the same ideas that Hosea and Amos talk about, Micah also talks about, but Hosea and Amos are messages to Israel, whereas Micah is a message to Judah. Okay, so all of the sins that Israel got involved in, Judah did the same thing, but just lagged a little bit behind in time. So Micah ends up giving a similar message to Judah that Hosea and Amos gave to Israel. And then that leads us to Nahum, which is a message against Assyria and how God's going to punish Assyria. So that then brings us forward to Habakkuk. Okay, so Habakkuk is a pretty short book. And so we'll start with this. Does anybody have any questions? Just a general summary over what prophets we've talked about or anything like that? Okay. All right, Habakkuk. Oh boy, I don't know why I did that. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, for some reason the font didn't come over. Anyway, so his name is, I'm trying to read it. So it's Ha-va-kook, okay, is the way you would pronounce it. Sorry, no, that's not right. Ha-va-kook, okay, so it's basically like H-A-V-A-K-K-U-K is how you would say it in Hebrew, okay? So it's a little bit different than the English. So his name is unusual because it's a little bit hard to know what it means, although most people think it comes from an Akkadian word. So if you remember, I was talking about the language of Akkadian earlier. Akkadian is the language of Assyria. But all these languages are intertwined, and they have words they borrow from each other. And so they think that his name actually comes from an Akkadian word for a plant. And obviously the word didn't come over up there. So it is Habakkuk, okay, is the Akkadian word, all right? So anyways, they think it's a plant that he's named after. You know, you can think a lot of people named after plants, different flowers, or whatever the case may be. So it's kind of the same idea. All right, so really don't know anything about him. He doesn't, his father's name isn't mentioned. It doesn't mention his hometown. He's not mentioned outside of his book in the Old Testament, I don't think. And so he doesn't say anything about himself. So you really don't know anything about him other than whatever, you know, he writes in the book here. Okay, so there are some legends. I've debated whether to even put this in here. This is all false. I'll just tell you this is false before we even talk about what it says. These are legends, okay, so it's not true. But there are some legends about him. So there's a story called Bel and the Dragon. Has anybody ever heard of Bel and the Dragon? Okay. Anybody heard of the apocryphal books before? They're in the Catholic Bible, etc. So if you know, the Catholic Bible has additional books in it that are called apocryphal books, and I think Bel and the Dragon is one of them, if I remember right. In that book, it suggests he's from the tribe of Levi, and then what he says in chapter 3, verse 19, he mentions some stringed instruments, and people say, oh, that means he's a Levite. It doesn't really mean that, but anyway. There is another legend, a book called The Lives of the Prophets, and then that one, it suggests he's actually from the tribe of Simeon. Again, none of this is based on any fact. And then in Bel and the Dragon, it says that he was sent by God to feed Daniel while Daniel was in the lion's den. Basically, God magically picked him up, moved him from Judah to Babylon, and so he could give Daniel something to eat. But the timeline doesn't even match for that. They didn't live at the exact same time. So this is fake. So don't pay any attention to this, other than just to know there's some legends out there about him. Okay, the prophet does not mention anything in the book that allows for precise dating. So he doesn't mention a king. He doesn't even mention who the enemies are, but you can deduce who he's talking about. He doesn't mention any specific historical events to be able to narrow it down precisely. He mentions these invaders. And so he's talking about the Chaldeans, okay? And I probably shouldn't even put the word Chaldeans up there. Chaldeans and the Babylonians, they're the same people. It's just a different term. So if you use like an old King James, for instance, it'll often have the term Chaldeans in it instead of Babylonians. It's the same people, so just don't get them confused. So the Babylonians defeat Assyria and Nineveh in 612. Which is what we just studied about in Nahum, okay? So Nineveh and Assyria fall in 612 to Babylon. And so after the Babylonians defeat the Assyrians, they do push into Syria. Assyria and Assyria, just remember those are two different countries, not the same place. So they do push into Syria in between 605 and 601. And so Habakkuk's not going to mention, at least in his book, he doesn't say anything about the Babylonians coming into Judah, okay? So some people suggest, okay, well maybe the book is, sometime after the Babylonians pushed into Syria, but before they pushed into Judah. Okay, so that would make it a pretty narrow window of time, somewhere around 600 to 597. So we know that Babylonians go into Judah in 597. So that's their first invasion. They capture Jerusalem in 597. They eventually destroy Jerusalem in 586, but their first takeover of the city is in 597. So probably written before 597, but at least after 612. So somewhere in that kind of 15-year time frame, okay? All right, so these are some slides from the Nahum introduction, but just to kind of paint you a picture, the more you hear it, the more maybe some of this will kind of stick. I know it's a lot of names and all that kind of stuff, so I don't really expect you to remember all that. But the idea here again, so remember Babylon is over here, and the main cities are like and Susa that you can kind of see in the middle of the circle there. And so Babylon goes up and they defeat Assyria with the capital there at Nineveh. And then the survivors of Assyria flee Nineveh and go to Haran, which is in the middle of the circle there. And they get defeated there. And so then Babylon is going to push over to, can everybody see the city in the middle called Carchemish? Is that, I don't know how well you can even see that. Anyway, it's in the center of this circle. It is on the Euphrates River up there. Carchemish is kind of on the border of modern-day Turkey and Syria, where those two countries come together. And so what's going to happen is, so Babylon defeats Assyria in 612, and then some of Assyria kind of straggles over to Haran. They beat them and so forth. But what happens is Egypt tries to send Assyria help, okay? So, you know, Assyria and Egypt usually don't like each other, but for whatever reason, Egypt decided they wanted to like Assyria better than they wanted to like Babylon. So they try to help Assyria, and so they send troops up from Egypt, up the coast, up to Carchemish. But on the way, and I'll show you this on a slide in a minute, on the way they end up fighting with Judah. And Egypt didn't want to fight with Judah, they just had to get up the coast to get to that area up in Carchemish. But Judah ends up fighting with them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in 605, what happens is there's a big battle at Carchemish where Babylon beats Egypt, okay? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to show you the map again. All right, so what's going to happen? So if you back up in time a little bit, Manasseh was a horrible king in Judah. Manasseh was a bad king. And it's an inside joke. And so after Manasseh dies, Ammon is king for a couple years, and then he gets assassinated because he wasn't any good either. And then Josiah is made king. So Josiah becomes king when he's 8, but you know, you don't really want an 8-year-old running your country. So there are some regents or, you know, older guys that kind of help him run it until he's old enough to know what he's doing. And so once he gets old enough to kind of run things, it happens to coincide with when the last powerful king of Assyria dies, okay? So the last really strong king of Assyria is Ashurbanipal, and he dies in 627. So if you notice, Assyria is really strong up till 627, so they're only going to survive 15 more years, okay? So that kind of tells you how important good leadership is. If you can go from being the strongest country in the entire known world to not even a country at all in 15 years, okay? And that's what's going to happen to them. So Ashurbanipal dies in 627. Assyria becomes sort of weak after he dies. And what that does is, once Assyria becomes weak, they can't really control all of their vassal kingdoms anymore, okay? And so the vassal kingdoms can kind of start to do what they want again because Assyria doesn't have the strength to keep their thumb on them, okay? So what happens is when Josiah is king, they discover the book of the law in the temple, and Josiah decides, hey, we need to start following this again. We haven't been doing what we should be doing. And he's able to do that in part because Assyria is weak. So if he had tried to do those same reforms when Assyria was strong, Assyria would have just come in and said, nope, you're not doing this, because they would have viewed it as a threat to their rule, okay? But when Assyria is weak, they won't do anything about it. And so God providentially had this happen where Josiah could discover, or my assumption, let me preface with that. My assumption is God providentially allowed Josiah to discover the book of the law and implement the reforms at a time when he could actually do so without Assyria trying to stop them from doing it, okay? And so these are some of his reforms that we talked about. So the reforms occurred in 622. He cleansed the temple, he centralized worship back in Jerusalem, got rid of some of the other false sanctuaries like Bethel and so forth, okay? All right, so, but now as you move forward in time, so Josiah was a good king for a while, but if you want to say he made a mistake, I guess you could call it that. So when Egypt decides, okay, we're going to go help Assyria, we're going to go up the coast, and we're going to go to that place called Carchemish, and we're going to fight against Babylon to try to salvage Assyria, they have to pass through Judah on the way. And Josiah doesn't want them to go up there and help Assyria. Why? Everybody hates Assyria, right? So Josiah doesn't want them to help Assyria. And so Josiah fights against Egypt, all right? Well, he gets killed in the battle, which is a big loss for the country of Judah. So he loses to Pharaoh Necho II at Megiddo, and he dies as a result of that, and that's pretty much the beginning of the end of any decent king in Judah, okay? So after Josiah's death, his son, Jehoahaz, is made king. Jehoahaz is only 23 years old, okay? Would we want a president that's 23? Probably not, okay? So he's not going to be an all-star king. He's only 23. And so he becomes king, but Pharaoh Necho didn't want him to be king, and he basically just defeated Judah, so he can kind of do what he wants. And so he takes him off the throne because he doesn't want Jehoahaz on the throne, and he puts one of his brothers on the throne instead. Okay, so Jehoahaz gets taken to Egypt as a captive, and he never gets out of Egypt. That's where he spends the rest of his days. So instead of Jehoahaz, he puts Eliakim on the throne and changes his name to Jehoiakim, okay? So Pharaoh Necho is the one doing this. So Pharaoh Necho, after he defeats Judah, he puts a different king on the throne. He does go up to Carchemish to fight against Babylon, and he gets beat, okay? So then 605, Egypt loses to Babylon at Carchemish, and so now Egypt has one of the reasons they were doing it is they didn't want Babylon to take over that part of the ancient Near East because they had some financial interest in it. And so once they lost all that territory that they had any influence over, and it all became part of Babylon, okay, or Babylon's vassal states. And so once Egypt lost that battle, they had to just basically retreat to what we kind of traditionally think of as the area of Egypt, and they were never able to go back into what we call Asia Minor again. And so that kind of ended their influence into that area. So Jehoiakim ruled as king for a little while, but then so when Babylon takes over and Judah becomes a vassal state of Babylon, Jehoiakim does submit to Babylon, but he ends up revolting after a period of time. And this would be about when the book of Habakkuk would be written, okay? So when Jehoiakim is your king, Babylon is is over your country, you're a vassal state of Babylon. So Jehoiakim revolts, and he dies, and his son, who is Josiah's grandson, so remember Jehoiakim is Josiah's son, so Josiah's grandson / Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiachin becomes king. And he reigns as king for 3 months and submits to Nebuchadnezzar in 597. But he's taken captive to Babylon in 597, okay? So he's not king for very long, just a few months, really. And he actually lives the rest of his life in in Babylon, and he has a pretty good life. If you read the last 4 verses of 2 Kings, it actually tells you what happens to him. He lives there till he dies. So he's taken there in 597. There's archaeological evidence of him being there. They have found some records of how much food he would get a day, as well as his children and so forth. This is all, outside of the Bible, but it's archaeological evidence that all this is true. So Nebuchadnezzar will eventually die in 562, and his son, Evil Merodach, becomes king of Babylon. And Evil Merodach actually was very nice to Jehoiachin and would let him come eat at his table and would make sure he had whatever he wanted. And so Evil Merodach actually was really good to him. And his name, Evil, doesn't mean he's a bad guy, okay? Evil Merodach means man of Marduk. It just means he's like a servant of their god Marduk. And I know that was the second bell, so let me just kind of quickly zip through this. So Jehoiachin is deported to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar puts another guy on the throne named Mattaniah. He changes the name to Zedekiah. He's only 21. This is another son of Josiah. So Josiah actually had 3 sons that were king as well as a grandson, okay? And it gets confusing. So Jehoiakim, and what's the other one? And then Zedekiah are 3 sons of Josiah that were king, and then his grandson Jehoiachin is also king, okay? So he's going to be the last king of Judah up until the city is destroyed in 586. And we'll just stop for there. But does anybody have any questions? So that just gives you a little bit of the background of Habakkuk. So Habakkuk, we have now moved beyond Assyria. Assyria is no longer a country. Babylon is now our world power that we'll be dealing with for the next several prophets as we go forward. And so Habakkuk is on the very early end of Babylon being the world power. Anybody have any questions or thoughts? Okay. Well, good to see everybody. Hope you stay warm the rest of the week.